This video will cover the different types of comparisons that we're going to be using throughout the comparing and scaling units. Our first type of, or before we look into the different types of comparisons, we need to review what a ratio is, because all of these are going to be different types of ratios. From stretching and shrinking, you should remember that a ratio is a comparison of two quantities, and there are three different ways to write a ratio. We can write it using symbols, meaning the colon, 4:5. We can write it as a fraction, 4/5, or we could say it using words, meaning 4:5. Let's look into the different types of ratios that we can talk about. The first one is a part-to-part ratio. With every situation, or with every example, we're going to look at the same situation, which is going to be a class that has 20 total students, with 11 students being boys and 9 students being girls. Our first type of ratio is a part-to-part ratio. This is where we compare one part of a whole to another part. So in this case, we're going to compare the two parts of the class, the boys and the girls. We typically write part-to-part ratios using symbols or words. So once again, we're going to compare the boys to the girls. So if I use symbols, I would use the 11:9, and I would precede it with the ratio of boys to girls is 11:9. If I wanted to put it into words and not use the symbols and explain it a little bit more, I would say something like, for every 11 boys, there are 9 girls. When we talk about part-to-part ratios, we're talking about the key word or the key phrase, for every. So I could also say, for every 9 girls, there are 11 boys. There's two specific types of part-to-part we're going to look at, and the first one is the difference. A difference, once again, is a specific type of part-to-part ratio. It compares one part of a whole to another by finding how much larger one is than another. We know that difference means subtraction. So if we look at our class again of 11 boys and 9 girls, we could say there are 2 more boys than girls because 11 minus 9 is 2. We could say there are 2 less girls than boys, same thing. Or we could say the boys outnumber the girls by 2 students. Those are all different ways of stating the difference between 11 boys and 9 girls. The second type of part-to-part ratio we're going to talk about is using a scale factor. This is going to compare two numbers using multiplication and tell us how many times larger one part is than the other. And we've used scale factors, just maybe not quite in this sense. So what we're thinking about here is the scale factor. We have 9 girls and we have 11 boys, and we want to know how many times larger is the amount of boys than girls. So we would say 9 times what is going to give me 11, and we've done this so many times now. We know that to figure this out in our calculator, we take 11 divided by 9, and we're getting it 1.2 repeating. So we would say that there's about 1.2 times as many boys as there are girls in this classroom. That's how we would use a scale factor to compare two quantities. Let's move on to our second type of ratio. That's a part-to-whole ratio. A part-to-whole ratio compares one part of a quantity to the whole, usually written as a fraction or words. Often we might just call it a fraction. So a part-to-whole ratio is going to compare the boys to the whole class or the girls to the whole class, and our key phrase here is going to be out of. So let's start by comparing the girls. There are 9 girls for every 20 students, or excuse me, there are 9 girls out of every 20 students, or 9 out of every 20 students are girls. There's many different ways to say this, but you can see over here that we would write it 9 girls over 20 students. The same thing applies for boys. It would be 11 boys out of 20 students, and this should say boys right here. That should be boys. The last thing we'll talk about is a percent, and a percent just takes a part-to-whole ratio one step farther. So we know that percents compare things out of 100. So if we say we wanted the percent of the class that is girls. So I would want to know the percent of girls. So I would say that there are 9 girls out of 20 students. And we know, or we should know, that in order to find a percent, we're going to divide these. 9 divided by 20 in my calculator is going to give me 0.45. Now that's not my percent. Remember, in order to convert a percent or a decimal to a percent, you need to do one of two things, which is the same thing, but one of two methods. You either need to multiply this by 100, or the trick for multiplying by 100 is to move your decimal point 2 places to the right. So this is going to equal 45%. I would say that 45% of the class is girls. If I wanted to do boys, it would be much of the same thing. And I'm going to give you kind of like a little template here that you can use for anything. So if I want the percent, anytime we think of a percent, we should automatically think of a percent as being a part out of a whole. So in this case, the part we're looking at is the boys, and the whole we're looking at is the students. So in this class, there are 11 boys out of 20 students. If I were to divide those, I would get 0.55, which I know by moving my decimal point 2 places to the right is going to give me 55% boys. Okay. So that would be another way that we could compare different quantities. We've just talked about 5 different ways that we can compare quantities. Part-to-part ratios compare 2 parts, typically using a symbol or using words. And we had 2 specific type of part-to-part ratios. That was the difference, which means we subtract, or the scale factor, which means we're going to multiply to see how much bigger one is than the other. And we also talked about part-to-whole ratios, which meant we compared one part to the whole thing. So we compared the boys to the class or the girls to the class. We typically wrote that as a fraction, and then we could take it one step farther and convert that fraction into a percent. So you should feel comfortable with the 5 different types of comparisons we just talked about and be ready to use those throughout the unit.